Today, I have the honor and privilege of having a discussion with Alexander Khodakovsky. Um, I believe for anybody who lives in Russia, he is well known. He is the commander of the Vostok Battalion, and he has been involved in the fighting in the Donbas region since 2014. So I'm looking forward to this to get some history of the battle for the Donbas, and frankly speaking, an update from the benefit of somebody who's on the battlefield about what's really going on in the battle for the Donbas and in southern Ukraine today. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Alexander Khodakovsky. Welcome, sir. It's an honor to talk with you.
Привилегия говорить с вами.
Look, let's just cut to the chase here. Americans, we don't know anything about you. We don't know anything about the Vostok Battalion. For us, what's going on in Ukraine is an unprovoked invasion of a sovereign nation by the Russian military. I imagine you have a little bit different take on this. Could you explain briefly who you are, how you got to be involved in the Vostok Battalion, in the fighting for the Donbas, and what the situation is in Donbas today, roughly speaking? We'll get into the specifics of the actual fighting in a minute, but I'd like to turn it over to you for a chance to explain to the American people more about who you are and the reality of the situation you find yourself in.
Ну, давайте начнем с вопроса, кто я.
Let's start with the question who I am.
Я не сепаратист.
I'm not a separatist.
Человек, который
I'm not an insurgent. I'm not a person who was against the ambassadors of the states. I'm, first of all,
сотрудник правоохранительного органа,
the security service officer who took part in 2014 in things happened in Kiev on Maidan events, so-called. At that point of time, I didn't have any battalion Vostok. I was the officer of the intelligence unit specialized in anti-terrorist combating. At that time, I was the representative of the authority led by Mr. Yanukovych, and at that time we tried to localize the insurgents of non-authorized forces which happened in Kiev and which had the task to perform a coup d'etat in Ukraine. So understanding this background, so it's quite easier to see how the Battalion Vostok appeared. Initially, when through the coup d'etat, through the democratic election happened in 2014 in Ukraine, not everybody agreed to that outcome. I was among those who was on the part of Yanukovych, of the in-power authority, but since Yanukovych refused to fight for his authority, you can compare with the situation in election in America when Biden won, but Trump continued his fight. So in political field, there was some kind of confrontation, but in Ukraine this kind of confrontation led to the armed confrontation. So, since we didn't have any forces, we didn't have any law enforcement agencies, those who didn't want to accept those results of Maidan coup d'etat, so we agreed to create a voluntary units, and one of these units was the Battalion Vostok. So initially, we didn't act against the authorities in power, vice versa, we supported the power which was considered to be legitimate and was considered to be quite legal. And only after this power undergone coup d'etat in our region, in Donbas, in Donetsk, we took the power in our own hands. And we rejected to accept the power of those who came to us through coup d'etat, as I've said, and to the realm in Kiev. So we believe that this way of taking power through non-democratic way was not acceptable to us. So we refused to accept the government which was led by Mr. Poroshenko and in some period of time was led by Mr. Zelensky. So initially, as sound might sound, so we supported the democracy, we supported the acting legal power, those laws which existed in Ukraine. In fact, we were not insurgents, we're not rebels who tried to defeat the foundations of the powers. Vice versa, we supported the acting power. Me, as an officer of law enforcement agency, I'm first of all a person who supports the public stability and kind of law preservance. But in the course of time, the situation developed in the course we see right now. On the one hand, we acted against illegitimate coup d'etat in Kiev. On the other hand, being the citizens of the Donbas region, we were pro-Russian. And the course undertaken by the new government of Ukraine towards West, towards Europe particularly, turned out to be unacceptable to us, since the only status which we were ready to accept was the neutral status of Ukraine, which shouldn't be the part of any alliance and which should keep neutrality between the Western countries and Russia. But due to the events, we were deprived of the opportunity to elect and to select this opportunity. So we decided to realize these kind of circumstances in this way. So that's how it started. All the forthcoming events was the kind of implication of this initial logic behind. So initially we were against those events happened in Ukraine, which we call Maidan or coup d'etat. Of course, the events which I participate right now is a bit different. It's only the implication of the first initial. If we don't understand this causal relationship, we don't understand the origin, the background of the whole situation. If we do understand what was the reason for that, so the logic is quite clear to us. What is happening right now? Right now, the Americans have the opportunity. They seem to believe that Russia took an aggressive action against Ukraine, invaded Ukraine, but there are some points which we need to highlight. First, 8 years after coup d'etat happened in Ukraine, and the American audience should understand that, 8 years after Russia agreed to recognize a newly elected president of Ukraine, Mr. Poroshenko, and Ukraine was to meet us halfway. Ukraine didn't fulfill any Minsk agreements signed not only with Russia, but in the intermediation role of Europe, particularly Germany and France and England. There was a communique signed which implied a particular order of political action, peaceful political actions. In the course of 8 years, since 2014 till 2022, Ukraine didn't fulfill any task, any clause in this Minsk agreement, and unilaterally Ukraine violated the political order of events. So Russia, at the end of 2021, has exhausted all the tools to put pressure on Ukraine to push Ukraine into political resolution of the conflict in the east of Ukraine. There were some attempts, there were regular meetings, there were some agreements signed, other communiques signed, to try, through a peaceful tools, without military escalation, tried to find a resolution to the conflict in the east of Ukraine, which I would like to reiterate was the implication of coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014. If we ignore this particular fact, I'd like to reiterate that we don't understand the background, the history behind this conflict. Anyway, the situation right now is the implication or ramification of what happened before. So, following this logic, we need to understand how it works right now. But what is happening right now is a direct implication of coup d'etat in 2014 in Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much for that. You know, I read an interview you gave in January of this year, and it struck me. A couple things struck me. First of all, you said Russia needs to send 30,000 troops to the Donbas to help prepare the defenses of the Donbas because the Ukrainian army was getting ready to attack, and that you were concerned that the people's militia of the Donbas, of Donetsk and Lugansk, would not be able to withstand the Ukrainian advance, and that you needed Russia to come to your assistance. So, I'd like you to talk about the threat you perceived from the Ukrainian military in January, but as important, you talked about the number of people fighting for the Donbas, and you said there were around 40,000 people under arms, but only 10,000 could be considered combat effective. But then you said something that struck me. You said, these are men who have known war for 8 years. These are men who knew the reality of the battlefield for 8 years. You see, most Americans think the war in Ukraine started on February 24th, when Russia moved in and initiated special military operation. But your interview suggested that there was a body of men in the Donbas, 10,000 strong, who had experienced war for 8 years. So I'd appreciate if you could expound on that, both in terms of the threat posed by Ukraine in January, but also, what do you mean war for 8 years? Was there really a war in the Donbas for 8 years? I'm being facetious here, because I know there was. I'm not trying to insult you. I'm trying to show the ignorance on the part of many people who might be listening to this program who don't realize that there was a real war going for 8 years before this current conflict started.
Let's reiterate one more point. Why so little? Why so few? For your audience to understand, for your American audience to understand, our area, which was under our control, was around 2.5 million citizens. Of course, our inscription mobilization potential was more than 10,000 people fighting, but since there were some kind of agreements signed with the Ukrainian party that the conflict which occurred in 2014 should be resolved in a political way, so we, as a Donbas region, will be a part of Ukraine, but we're going to have an autonomous status. So we didn't need to mobilize other people. So the 10,000 troops, which after coup d'etat in Kiev rebelled against this coup d'etat, stayed this kind of forces on duty which we had. Since there was a political roadmap in place, we didn't have the necessity to increase this number of troops. But when we found out and when we heard that Ukraine was going to assault us, to attack us, and it was clear, since all the peaceful agreements signed with Ukraine were not fulfilled by Ukraine, we even know the president as Mr. Surkov, who was responsible for the relations with Ukraine in Russia, since he didn't manage to build the right communication with Ukraine, was to resign from his office in Moscow. So another person was appointed, another Russian official was appointed, who had the task to correct the situation and to find kind of common ground for peaceful resolution of the conflict with Ukraine. So the whole system was built on the assumption that we didn't have to increase this number of troops. But when we saw that Ukraine was not going to implement those peaceful agreements, it was absolutely clear, and according to Ukrainian officials and according to the statement of the political and public forces which dominate the agenda in Ukraine, that the only way they saw was to capture our territory back. So within a short period of time, we didn't manage to increase our military potential, so we had to resort to Russia and ask them to help and to ward off. We needed around 30,000 troops on duty, real fighters, so I urge Russia to have this peacekeeping body to stop Ukraine, to prevent Ukraine from its attempts to attack us and to seize control over Donbas. I'd like to reiterate once again, there's over 8 years since 2014, after coup d'etat, till 2022, we expected, we counted on the conflict, peaceful political resolution. As a result, we had this body of regular fighters which allowed us to keep the public order and which allowed us to ward off Ukraine at the front line, on the front line. So the war was conducted at that point of time, and so the destruction of Donetsk and the territories surrounding were quite considerable. If the American audience thinks that it started only in February 24, it's a big mistake of yours. In fact, the war started in 2014. In this war, we were as combatants, as militia, we were those in the battlefield, but it was clear that Ukrainian forces were much bigger than our potential. So we did require extra external support. If we hadn't signed this Minsk agreement, peaceful agreements, so this is the name of the city where these agreements or accords were signed, we would have mobilized, we would have provided weapons for our militia and for our forces, and we didn't have 10,000 troops, but it might have been much bigger, and we could resist them on our own in terms of defense. For offense, we didn't have enough troops, enough resources. Then for the defense, the resources would be enough. But we trusted Ukraine. We believe that Ukraine was in position to fulfill those agreements which were achieved, which were signed through the intermediation of the European countries. But it turned out that Ukraine was not going to fulfill those agreements. And we faced the music. Since tomorrow, we may face very active stage of battlefield, as since 2014 the war was kind of permanent, was kind of defensive war. There were some kind of flashes, some kind of hostilities on the front line, but in general Ukraine didn't undertake any serious offensive acts. But at the end of 2021 it was clear that all the political possible ways to regulate and resolve the conflicts were the stalemate situation, and the only way to find a resolution to the conflict was only the military operation. But we were not ready for that military operation, so as a result we had to resort to Russia for them to assist us and to support that we did require.
You know, war is an unforgiving mistress. I don't think I need to tell you that. And people who haven't been to war don't understand it. I read another interview where you talked about the battle for Mariupol and the role that the Vostok battalion played. And you described very difficult fighting, house-to-house fighting, street-to-street, but fighting that was designed to minimize casualties because the Vostok battalion does not have an infinite supply of manpower. And you spoke at one time about the frustration that you felt when reinforcements arrived from Chechnya. You spoke of very strapping men, brave men with beards, but they lacked the weapons, they lacked the tactics, they lacked the experience, and that they began to engage in a fight that that would create casualties on their part. I believe you believe there would be unnecessary casualties. Could you describe the dynamic? Because right now we think of this as a Russian conflict. But the reality is it's an alliance. It's an alliance between Russia, the Donetsk People's Republic, the Lugansk People's Republic, and then some other units, for instance, the Chechen units that come in. Can you describe the nature of this alliance and the role that the Donetsk People's Republic plays in the command structure? Are you in charge of the battlefield? Who's in charge of the battlefield?
You know, Mariupol operation, first of all, is a combined operation. There was a single decision-making center, but it consisted of several centers which took part in this military operation in Mariupol. the representative of Donetsk People's Republic were a part of the special headquarters responsible for decision-making, and depending on the weight of the people, those have the right to make the final decision, but we were in charge of communicating with each other and to advise each other. You were right to mention that the battles were conducted by the alliance, but the Chechen unit cannot be regarded as the single unit, as their Chechen unit were a part of the Russian military forces. You know, my concerns when the Chechen unit appeared in the theater, they were just raised by the fact that the Chechen unit didn't understand these circumstances. We found ourselves in those circumstances for 8 years, since 2014. We have been engaged in permanent military confrontation. We understood our enemy quite well. We understood which potential our adversary has, which tactics, which methods and strategies they used. At the same time, when they were not well prepared, Chechen troops for that particular military confrontation, there were some risks that they would have suffered some real casualties. So my only concern was that those units which entered a new battlefield, new specifics of the battlefield, might face increasing casualties and not to fulfill the task they had in front of them. In fact, the Chechen troops were very fast to adapt to the situation. They gained the necessary set of skills, and they started to participate in the battlefield as a representative of the Russian military forces to the maximum possible potential. And the following action in the battlefield demonstrated that those units were fast to adapt, as I've said, and started to demonstrate very high combat efficiency. So when we started this Mariupol operation, so Mariupol is a city of more than 500,000 people, has very good suburban areas, and the area is huge. The front line, which occurred around Mariupol, included the Russian military forces, Chechen units, which were a part of Russian military forces. I'd like to reiterate these points, and included the units of Donetsk People's Republic, which accounted for 35% of the total number of the military forces participating in Mariupol operation. But with our expertise of the adversary helped us to be in charge of the situation, which we have been fighting for over 8 years, as I've said. So we felt ourselves in that situation more comfortable. We were more positive about the decisions we made. And so for all those participating in this operation required some time to adapt to the situation. But the war is a very intense thing, so the period of adaptation moves fast. All the units which participated in on the battlefield in Mariupol for a very short period of time entered the so-called regime of war and started to demonstrate the maximum combat efficiency.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask another question now about another fighting force that has appeared in Donetsk. I understand if you can't answer it, I don't want to infringe on any sensitivities, but they are publicly referred to, and I'm talking about the Wagner private military contractors. They have made headlines in their participation in some very heavy combat in the Bakhmut area of the battlefield. Are you able to comment on Wagner, their participation, how they came about to be in Donetsk, and what your opinion of them is?
I believe that the American audience should understand that in Russia there are no real private military contract companies. There is no even a law for these companies to operate these private military contract companies of Wagner is a kind of a unit of the Russian military forces, which have been mobilized based on a special type of the contract. Of course, there is a question concerning financing, and the material support is a question of a separate segment. It's not under the Russian military forces, but all the private military companies do not act alone. They don't have their own roadmap, but they act only in combination with regular on-duty forces. The Russian military forces act on the same plan. There is no one unit of a private military conflict which has a particular task. We call them like that because it's a kind of buzzword for us. In fact, if we look at the Russian law, so for operation of private military companies, there is no legal basis, there is no legal framework. So, for example, such units as airborne forces in Russia, for instance, there is a special brigade or unit which allows to attract for the surface with the people with very high qualification, but who ceased their contract fighting before that. But in the situations like that, when the state requires additional troops, the state might resort to the specialists, which have high qualification for them, to shape special units, under the auspices, under the leadership of the General Headquarters of Russian Federations, to perform these important tasks. There is no single unit of Wagner, private military company, solves no separate single tasks. They only fulfill the tasks which are set by the Russian military headquarters. And this is a total difference between the Russian private military company from other military companies. They do not make money on the war, and this is the principal difference. They fulfill those functions, those tasks, which are regulated by the state. There is no single military private organization, which is only partially private, to be honest. In Russia, there is no free circulation of weapons, of guns, of explosives, or of heavy artillery, or jet fighters, and no private military company has an opportunity to buy the necessary weaponry or warfare. It can get only from the state. It is necessary to understand, to assess these private military companies. These, in Russia, are totally provided by the state in terms of the weaponry. So the difference is only about the financing, raising money to finance such high-skilled people who used to be military officers or military fighters in the past. So this private investment is raised, and the people who fulfill these military tasks work only for the interests of the state.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate the answer, and I think many people listening also appreciate it. It's good to get the truth about that, your insights. This conflict, this current phase of this conflict, which began on February 24th, has gone on for over 6 months now. And we've seen I believe, a decisive shift in the nature of the conflict that began when NATO and the United States began providing significant quantities of advanced weaponry and also specialized training to the Ukrainian armed forces. When this began in April, I called it a game changer. Not that it meant that Ukraine was going to win the war, but that this massive infusion of military equipment and training and the logistical support provided and intelligence support provided by NATO was changing the nature of the game. It was making the conflict more complicated and more deadly for Russia and Donetsk, Lugansk, and the allies, and also for Ukraine. We've seen weapons such as HIMARS, the M777, the artillery, the French Caesar artillery, drones, Turkish drones, etc. Am I right? Was this a game changer, or did this not have any impact at all on the battlefield? I mean, you're a frontline fighter. How do you feel about the massive transfer of NATO heavy weapons to the Ukrainian armed forces.
You're absolutely right to say that, but you know, the truth somewhere in the middle, as we say in Russia. There is no truth for everybody. So, of course, it was a game changer. It had impact on the situation. Of course, it caused more casualties. So we expected that with the Russian military forces, we, the units and the military forces of Donetsk and Lugansk republics, with a short period of time, we would have ceased this conflict and we would start this political resolution of the conflict as a task to destroy Ukraine, to have irretrievable damage to Ukraine was not in our mind. We understood that Ukraine is not only military forces of Ukraine. The military forces represent a tiny percentage of the population of Ukraine, and we need to think about the destiny and the fate of the whole Ukrainian population. We need to think about the consequences the war is going to bring about on the soul of Ukraine, on the destiny of Ukraine. The war cannot go without economic implications. As of today, we understand how these implications can be severe for all the participants of this conflict. Russia, having such resources, it has enough heat, it has gas, oil, it has processing powers and capacity. Ukraine has to buy all these things, since the energy prices are global market have risen a lot as a result of this conflict. Of course, the Ukrainian economy is undergoing a very serious transformation and there is huge pressure, but to create a pressure on the Ukrainian economy is one of the tasks of the war. But we need to understand that the main task of the war is not to destroy Ukraine, not to make it helpless, but to keep Ukrainian people's opportunity for normal existence in aftermath of the war. Before that, the war was to be finished in a very short period of time and start the peaceful resolution and building new bridges, building new format of life together. We always believed that Ukraine, due to its specifics, kind of reminded us the USA. Of course, it is a very, very abstract comparison. We know that there is a federal law in the USA, but every state has its own legal framework. For example, concerning aborts, concerning death sentences, death penalties, and each state has its own law, which in some cases is different from the federal law. And we believe that the fate of Ukraine should be like that. Following the fate of the USA, Ukraine should follow the federalization process, and each region, which is very different ethnically and economically, should have a particular autonomous status. We believe that Ukraine has an opportunity to keep its unity, given that the structure should be changed from unitary into the federal structure. Then, different ethnic groups in Ukraine, not even ethnic groups, but cultural groups and economic entities can coexist on a mutually beneficial basis. But at the same time, each group should have a particular level of autonomy to coexist. So we believe that the conflict should have been finished very fast. And at the end of the day, Ukraine was to be a federation, for its political structure to remind that of the Russian Federation or of the United States, where each state has a particular level of autonomy. This was the only ultimate goal of ours. So the military conflict had the task to give each group which lives in Ukraine to develop and exist in their own way. Unfortunately, as a result of the assistance provided by West, by Europe, by the USA, the conflict protracted, the pressure on economy rose, the casualty number rose, it didn't change the balance of powers, since Russia didn't start mobilizing in their own countries. They didn't declare mobilization. They only act through their forces on duty. And Ukraine has had several stages of mobilization, and today this threshold is 65 years old in Ukraine, so they are exhausting the mobilization potential in Ukraine. And there are people, elderly people, who are in military forces right now. They cannot even move fast, and they cannot fight. It says that Ukraine is undergoing a very serious pressure. And the help provided by Western countries, we call Western countries, but these are the countries of Europe and the USA, which are actually NATO alliance. So the assistance provided to Ukraine is a kind of very peculiar assistance, which doesn't really help Ukraine, but it leads to its final destruction. If the American audience, if the American citizens think that the help and the assistance provided to Ukraine really can lead to the victory of Ukraine, in fact, this assistance leads to the total destruction of Ukraine. So the more protracted the conflict is, the more severe consequences for Ukraine are going to happen, since Mr. Putin hasn't decided to conduct total mobilization yet. But if Russia, which population is more than 140 million people, in Ukraine they have less than 30 million people, if Russia declares mobilization, of course, in any case, regardless of the assistance provided by the US or any other countries of NATO, will win the war, with real casualties on their part, since the war, intense war, always leads to casualties on both sides. The more assistance provided by the West, the more casualties Russia suffers, but at the same time, the more fatal implications for Ukraine we will see. If the conflict had been over fast, it would have been less severe for Ukraine. But look at the circumstances today as a result of this conflict. So the site of nuclear power station is being shelled, and there is a threat of nuclear contamination in Europe, as it happened in 1986, as a Chernobyl catastrophe occurred. Today we see serious risk, particularly for Europe, and you know, there is a feeling that Europe doesn't understand where it is moving, what it is doing. So, you know, just to get some political dividends, Europe is assisting Ukraine through Caesars and other weaponry systems, but at the same time, if the consequences are not going to be controlled, Europe itself will face this very negative impact, will face negative consequences, since you cannot foresee the nature, and whenever the wind blows, where there is a nuclear catastrophe and the radioactive rain can be felt in Ukraine, in Europe, and this is going to be the direct implication of the assistance provided by Europe, by the US, unfortunately, to Europe. I cannot say that you shouldn't support, so it doesn't violate any international conventions, in a feasible logic. Ukraine is considered to be a partner of West, and the West is considered to be a partner. It is wants to join NATO alliance. Of course, you cannot reject this logic. This is a legitimate rule and opportunity of the Western to shape alliances for their own interests, but at the same time, we need to understand those circumstances which can happen as a result of the situation. In the course of 8 years, we expected, particularly from Europe, not from the US. The US was not a part, intermediary of those Minsk agreements. And we cannot just say to the US that you are to blame for not following this Minsk agreement, but we are to blame Germany and France. They were intermediaries and guarantees of those Minsk agreements. If Europe had put enough pressure on Ukraine to fulfill those clauses in Minsk agreements which had been signed by Ukraine and which were supposed to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict, which, I would like to reiterate, happened as a coup d'etat in Ukraine 2014. If Europe had put enough pressure on Ukraine within these 8 years, there wouldn't have been any necessity to move to more drastic pressure on Ukraine. We understood which consequences it might have led to, but we're not talking about the consequences for a small area, which is Lugansk People's Republic and Donetsk People's Republic. We're talking about the global consequences. The conflict is moving into the stage when the consequences cannot be calculated. No algorithms, no mathematical calculations are not able to see these possible scenarios. Can you imagine that even the catastrophe at one nuclear power plant, which one of the biggest, most powerful in Europe, may lead to such circumstances, which will seem catastrophic compared with this military conflict? We do understand that all the states which are not directly involved in the conflict will suffer the consequences, but indirectly they do assist, they do help Ukraine. The outcome of this situation is quite clear, is predetermined. Ukraine, even though they are fighting, and sometimes very efficiently, has not the potential to stop Russia and our units. The question is about time and consequences, the magnitude of this consequence. We didn't have the task to destroy Ukraine. We didn't have the task to fatally destroy America or Europe. Didn't exist. After 8 years of these unsuccessful attempts to put pressure on Russia was through military confrontation, make them fulfill these political agreements. When the political situation is in a stalemate, there is only way is through military conflict. Doesn't matter how many times the US resorts to Iraq authorities and just try to influence the mindset of the Iraq. America decided to take the situation under control in their own hands and to eliminate the authority of Iraq, which was not ready through political forces to provide the stability in the region. So, and Iraq attacked Kuwait. So we do understand that in case of stalemate, political stalemate situation, any party has the right to resort to military pressure. The US reserves this right. Russia considers itself a superpower and reserves this right as well. And Russia decided to use this right, to exercise this right, but the nature, the background of the situation lies back in 2014 because of this coup d'etat which happened in Kyiv, which unfortunately was approved and supported by Western European countries. There is a causal relationship which we cannot take out of the context. We need to clearly understand the order of these events.
Well, thank you for that. You spoke of a political stalemate that necessitated military action. If one takes a look at the situation in Ukraine today along the battlefield, one might call it a military stalemate. Is Russia winning? Is the Donetsk People's Republic prevailing? The headlines say that Ukraine is carrying out counterattacks, and Ukraine is proclaiming that it is beginning the process of liberating its occupied territory. The Vostok battalion's on the front lines. Are you guys losing? Or is this but propaganda and you're going to prevail? And if you are going to prevail militarily, is it going to require Russia to mobilize? Or are you able to win using the current force structure that's in place today?
I totally agree with your question. I totally agree that it is a legitimate question. We need to differentiate between propaganda and the reality on the battlefield. But we need to understand that the war is not a separate conflict, not a separate battle. War is a process which has kind of different stages. After 5 months of the offensive attacks, Russian military forces, as I have already said, haven't declared mobilization. They act in the number which was initially to effect this operation requires some kind of regrouping, some kind of break, requires understanding new strategy of new attacks. This is a natural process for any war. Any military person who understands the character of war understands that war might have different stages. There may be a stage of offense, there might be a stage of pause. It is impossible to conduct offensive operations all the time. It depletes the resources. The operation in Iraq was a conventional example. We followed how the second stage of the operation in Iraq happened when the regime of Hussein suffered the fatal strike. We understood that the American military forces, together with their allies, acted for the conflict not to move into the protracted stage, and the American military forces understood that all the resources was to be applied, all the possible tools should be applied, particularly aviation, the marine artillery, all the missiles the American forces had to fast suppress the opposition of Iraq military forces. I give you an example, since the history of war with Iraq is very close and understandable to the Americans. But what is happening right now are those faraway things which do not relate to Americans, which Americans do not understand. That's why I need to kind of give you kind of examples to compare that. But if the military conflict in Iraq had been in protruded stage, so after these first stages, American military forces required regrouping and required some pause. This is a natural process. And it is clear that the military circumstances require different modularities. And sometimes you need to have a concentration of troops in our military language. We need to have enough shells, enough ammunition, and different artillery systems which are being destroyed in the conflict. Everything should be accumulated, not through the whole front line, but in those particular most significant areas, which in the process of the battlefield can be regarded as the major offensive strike areas. For that, you need to analyze the current situation on the battlefield, you need to make some particular conclusions, and to accumulate enough sufficient resources in the most important areas. But at the same time, we understand that for having this kind of diluting strikes, you need to have resources on other areas. It all requires time. What is happening right now on the front line is a natural, planned pause of this offensive strike, which has been going on within 5 months. You know, I wouldn't say that there is no single army probably which can conduct this offensive strike within 5 months in a row. It's a very complicated task, and it requires sufficient resources. But we need to also understand additional factor for the American audience to understand what I'm saying. I keep on saying that both the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces have the same school, have the same technical resources. The Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian forces in USSR time was one of the most well-prepared forces and most equipped army in the Soviet Union. So those units, those battalions, those brigades, and those regions in Ukraine were equipped with the most advanced weaponry up to the standard, since Ukraine and other former USSR republics, which were responsible for so-called Western, Western approach, were considered the kind of forepost, as it was during Cold War, were supported to ward off the powers of the Western countries. We did understand that Ukraine was a territory with the most concentration of the military resources. In Ukrainian era, they had the biggest number of higher military schools, which prepared the military specialists. This is one of the factors which has its input. Ukraine has a very well-developed logistics infrastructure, which is very important in wartime. So when Russia decided to start military operation, it understood that it had to deal with a well-prepared adversary. I don't want to diminish the role or offend the American military forces, but I'd like to give an example, the military operation in Iraq. We know that the American military forces has a very huge military capacity and potential. We know that the American military forces have military skills. No one wants to say something bad about the American military forces. You know, I love Generation Q TV show, and I look at American military forces. I'm very satisfied with how the American actors played the American military just real life of military people. We see that the many processes in the US are the same like ours. These are the same people like we, and we look at you, we understand that you have absolutely the same people. You have heroes, you have cowards, you have everybody, as we do. But the Afghan operation against very, very weak military forces, not well prepared, not well equipped, but at the same time, for the American military forces, though powerful they are, there was a huge challenge. Since Afghanis, people who took arms in their hands, who knew the landscape, who find isolation in the mountains, they have kind of advantage in these mountains. And we understand that the American military machine didn't declare its defeat, but it's realized that it was not quite efficient, and they understood that it was not reasonable to continue its military operation in Afghanistan, and they decided to withdraw their forces from Afghanistan. So we compare the activity of an action of the American forces in Afghanistan. We don't say that it's because the American military is weak. It's not the case. American military was in a very specific landscape, specific circumstances. Iraq, the American forces were very efficient, though in Afghanistan, the American army and American forces were not that efficient. It's not about American military forces, but about the circumstances they found themselves in. If we're talking about the confrontation between Ukraine and Russia, we should be talking about the circumstances Russia faces. And these circumstances are not quite beneficial to Russia. We do not deal with the armies and military forces which are weak, which don't have equipment and weapon resistance. We have the military forces which are compatible to our military forces in terms of the weaponry and in their internal motivations. Nevertheless, over the 5 months period of time of the battlefield, we have taken control of 25% of the Ukrainian area, and it's quite legitimate that at this particular stage we decided to make a break, to regroup our units for further confrontation, understanding our situation, understanding our necessity for regrouping. The Ukrainian military leaders decided to use this period of time as we understand. I'm a military person, you are a military person as well, but you also fall in the military conflict, and absolutely sure that you understand the stages and the trends of political military operation. We do understand that the trends of the developments can be logically estimated, and the Ukrainian military leaders and those assistants and those intelligence from Poland, from England, from the Americans, they understood that there would be a period of time when the Russian army would require regrouping. We need to take a break to improve the resources, and that moment should be used for counterattack. It can be mathematically calculated. There is nothing mysterious about that. It's quite absolutely clear. And of course, when all the advisors, when all the analysts believed that there was a point for Russia to take this break, the Russian reserve forces, military forces, were preparing for that. And right now, Ukraine going under military attack, and they call it a counter attack. It's not like that. So we are the allied forces of the Russian Federation, Lugansk and Donetsk republics. We are in defense mode, but we're in this defense mode in natural way for regrouping. And, in the near future, of those commentators who follow the conflict will see that we are going to see the necessary potential in our hands, and we'll be able to continue our offensive attack. But at the same time, Ukraine, unfortunately, even though there is assistance from the Western countries, is going to exhaust the necessary tools. We need to be mathematicians with you, and we need to calculate the ratio for Russia and for Ukraine, and the capabilities of Russia and Ukraine. Of course, Russia and our military forces, of course, we feel huge pressure because of the assistance from West to Ukraine, but American military troops or European troops are not going to be a part of this conflict. And we do understand, but the final, what is going to be behind the troops, and Ukrainian military forces don't have enough troops. And those mobilized troops from different towns and cities of Ukraine, they cannot called qualified on-duty forces. They don't have enough time to prepare. After mobilization, they are in the battlefield, and their combat efficiency as soldiers is very low. Since Russia hasn't declared mobilization in Russia, it doesn't mean that Russia is not accumulating military forces. There are different alternative ways to mobilize volunteers, which are used by Russia very intensively today. Therefore, we have these capabilities to lick our wounds and to have enough potential to move forward and to continue our offensive strike.
Thank you very much for a very detailed and again kind of analysis and facts that isn't publicly available here in the U.S. or in the West, or if it is available, people just aren't availing themselves of it. I have one last question for you. You've been around since 2014. You've seen Maidan, the coup. You've experienced Donbas in the early stages. You've experienced the 8 years of conflict. You experienced the battle for Mariupol. You've spoken of forces. You've spoken of the coup plotters. But I haven't heard you say one thing. We know that there's two objectives Russia has announced. One is demilitarization. That is the destruction of the Ukrainian military or the NATO aspects of the Ukrainian military. But there's a second, denazification. I haven't heard you once say Bandera, Azov, Right Sector, or Nazi. Is this propaganda? Do these forces exist? Or are they a serious element? Are they a serious part of this fight? Or is this exaggerated on the part of Russia and certain elements in the West? So what is the state of play? I mean, you're from the Donbas. Is the ideology of Stepan Bandera real or a threat?
Let's speak as two adults, reasonable, cynic adults. We understand that any propaganda is about exaggerating things. It's natural. It's natural for the US, it's natural for Russia, it's natural for any other region in any state. But I would like to tell you that if it were not the case, if this factor didn't exist, the attitude to Ukraine would have been absolutely different. There is a combination of different factors. Economic interests, the interest of economic Ukrainian elites who wanted to move to the West to maintain their balance of powers. We need to understand the nature of the capital, the Western capital, and the nature of the post-Soviet capital. This is very important. Without understanding the nature of this conflict, it's impossible to understand things happening. If the Western capital had been accumulated starting from the medieval times, and in the hands of the American capital, rich people, it might be either the American dream when the Irish or the Scots went to America and was very successful at the gold mining or any type of business and accumulated his initial capital, then multiplied this capital. Or it might happen by accident, like Elon Musk case, which through generations didn't accumulate this capital, but this capital is kind of evolutionary nature. But the capital which is in the hand of the Ukrainian elites is a kind of a creative capital. It's a fast capital which happened as a result of the collapse of the USSR. In fact, so this is kind of theft from people. They didn't earn it. They didn't take it through generations, not through realizing American dream concept or something like that. And they are afraid that there's going to be a Moscow power and will take this capital out of their hands. And this is another factor of influence. But for you to understand, no single oligarch, as we call these big capitalists, is not going to move or to send their children to kill anyone, or is not going to go to die in the battlefield. You know, it's not true for the Western countries, even when the royal members go to the military forces, because there is a tradition behind, there is particular culture like that. The Ukrainian oligarchs need a tool, and these Nazis and national forces are a tool. We're talking about them as a secondary factor, because without the money of oligarchs, without the financing of the media support through mass media, these Nazis, these Bandera, would be regarded as this kind of marginal category of stratus of the population. Do you understand what I'm saying? Of course, we're not talking about them as about the major factor of influence, but this is kind of a tool. The soldier cannot shoot if he doesn't have a gun or a rifle. So this rifle, this gun, in the hands of these Ukrainian political elite and financial oligarchs are these national-oriented forces. And now, right now, these national-oriented forces is a kind of a special troops which from Napoleon battlefield, which use special units to shoot Spaniards when they decided to retreat. So these units used in Ukrainian forces not to let those mobilized people to retreat from the battlefield from all the Ukrainian cities. Do you understand which role they play? At the same time, they are kind of a tool in the hand of the financial groups which really own Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't have the entity, it doesn't have the state entity. Ukraine is ruled by the financial industrial groups which do not own this Ukraine, and only their interests determine the political future of Ukraine. But these financial industrial groups have their private military army forces which have a very radical Nazi ideology. And the representative of the financial and industrial groups, not being the true believers in these ideologies, they do encourage this ideology because that's in their own interest, since this ideology is anti-Russian nature. As of today, this is the objective picture. In Ukraine, these forces have accumulated huge potential and have taken many areas of life in Ukraine under their control. There was a period of time when they could indirectly influence the authorities, the officials, through the physical pressure. Right now, these Ukrainian oligarchs and the financial industrial groups invested in the war, and there is a war as the way to localize this particular event. To a particular extent, we can say that even with those who are afraid of those national forces, we are on the same side. And this is a kind of abstract comparison, but this says that these forces in Ukraine have a huge potential, since there is a big concern for those who have nourished and financed these forces.
Thank you very much. To be honest, that wasn't the answer I was expecting. It was much better. That was one of the most insightful analysis of the role played by right-wing military forces and their relationship with the oligarchs. And like the rest of this interview, enlightening. I thank you very much for your time. This has been one of the most interesting and valuable interviews I've conducted, and I hope the people watching appreciate that. We got some extremely insightful analysis from a man on the front lines, Alexander Kodakovsky, commander of the Vostok Battalion. Thanks for tuning in. Remember, knowledge is power. This has been the Scott Ritter Show.